Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are going to kick off the Power of Communication. It's our latest virtual event at the NAC. Um, as we're getting settled here, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We want to know where you're tuning in from, who you are, all that good stuff. And I'm Tessa O'Connell. I'm the Communications and Public Outreach Manager at the Natural Areas Conservancy. I'm just popping in to give a little bit of rules of the road, and then I will hand this event over to our moderator and guest speaker. So this is Zoom webinar. You can communicate with the panelists in the chat. We will have a Q&A session at the end, so be sure to ask your questions there or through the Q&A. I also believe Eric, our speaker, will have a little bit of interaction during his presentation. So if he asks you a question, that kind of stuff, you can interact in the chat function. I also just want to give a thank you to Con Edison. They are a generous supporter of the Natural Areas Conservancy. Their continued support allows us to hold events like this. Our Power of event series in spring and summer 2021 is due to Con Edison funding. So we are really grateful for their support in making events like this possible. Otherwise, I will hand things over to Lauren Graham. She is our NAC board member and moderator for this evening. So thank you, everybody, and enjoy the event.
Thank you, Tessa, and welcome everyone and good evening. Welcome to the Power of Communication. As Tessa mentioned, I'm Lauren Graham. I have the privilege of serving on the Natural Areas Conservancy Board, and I'm also a Yale School of the Environment 2013 MEM grad. So it's wonderful to be here with a fellow alum talking about climate communications. So our guest speaker for today is Eric Fine. He is MESC 2016, and he is the project manager for the Yale Program on climate change communication, and he also helps partner organizations communicate more effectively by leveraging the YPCCC's research findings. Prior to joining the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication in 2016, Eric worked for 15 years taking people on expeditions with Outward Bound, including here in New York City. While working on the receding glaciers of Patagonia, he was inspired to go back to school and to get his master's in environmental science at Yale, with a focus on climate communications in Latin America. So with that, I'll turn it over to Eric for the presentation. And as a reminder, please feel free to put questions in the question box, and then we'll take those at the end of the program. So over to you, Eric.
Good evening, all, and welcome. Let me just set my screen up the way I like it. And y'all can see my screen and hear me just fine. Lauren?
Looks good.
Sounds good. Okay. So my name is Eric Fine, and happy to join you this evening. I am a fan of the Natural Areas Conservancy. Like Lauren was just saying, before working here, I used to work for New York City Outward Bound for a while, and we were taking kids from the city on all kinds of expeditions and adventures around the city, and then also upstate. And then I grew up just across the Hudson in New Jersey as well. Lived in Long Island City for a while. While also working for Outward Bound, I worked throughout the Americas, including a lot down in Argentina and Chile. And that was the first time I ever came back to the same part of the same glaciers year after year. And this one right here, this is Cerro Tronador. And I just in first 2-3 years watched the snow line right here, where we would camp along the snow line, move up and up and uphill. And I met the families down over that way in this remote Chilean valley, and they couldn't grow the same crops that their parents and grandparents did. And then I met over on the Argentine side, a city that was dependent on the water flowing from these glaciers right here. And it hit me. I said, oh, wow, I think my next job needs to somehow be focused on climate change. What might that look like? And so I started figuring out what are all the solutions to climate change. which ones does it seem like I should work on, could work on? And there were too many that I liked. And I started thinking, well, is there a way to get more people throughout society behind all of these solutions? Started Googling things like environmental paradigm shift and environmental psychology, and found out that there are folks actually studying what people think about climate change and what kinds of communication strategies seem to move them. And so I was inspired. I came back to school, did my master's in environmental science, and then stayed on working with the program on climate change communication at Yale. So I'd like you to answer this question. Just drop your response in the chat right here. See what people are, how often people are talking about this. We got an often. Let's see how many oftens we have. Often, often, occasional, often, occasionally. Okay. Y'all are not common. And ooh, I see a rarely. That's a little more common. I'll show you what actually, how people across the United States answer this question right here. Does this surprise you? So we have only 38% of people right there who say often or occasionally. And then we have a majority of people who say either rarely or never. What's going on here? Anyone have any ideas? Drop them in the chat. What are your theories? Why aren't we talking about global warming more? We'll be looking at some data and some survey results that'll help us think about this question and what to do about it. But first, I'd like your estimate. Give me your answer to this question right here. Maybe you've seen the research and maybe you already know. I'd like you to give me your best estimate. 35%. What else? 60, 40. Okay, 25, 30, 40, 60. Okay. And seeing we're like straddling 50 by a good percentage points on each side right there. So we asked this question of people in the United States, and they on average guess around 50%. They say 54%. Say that global warming is happening. But we also know what the actual response is. It's 72 right there. So we're pretty off when we try and guess this, and we're pretty off when we try and guess what other people think about this issue in general. And one of the best things you can do if you want to talk about this, if you want to do something about this issue and communicate effectively, is to understand what actually other people are thinking about this. And this one is really interesting too. So we see 54% on average, but then we can break it down and see that these are how different groups estimate. So we see that the conservative Republicans, when we ask them how many people say it's happening, they say, 48, less than half. And liberal Democrats, all the way over here, get it all the way up to 63. They're still almost 10 percentage points off. So we're pretty bad at guessing it, and we underestimate it by a good chunk. Okay, but it's not so simple if you're trying to understand your audience as to be able to say, hey, there's people who say it's happening and people who say it's not. We found out that it's a lot more nuanced than that. And so we actually stole the idea of segmentation studies from lots of other disciplines and industries perhaps that are trying to sell sneakers to people. and understanding what are all the different ways people think about sneakers, what kinds of sneakers do people like, and how can we use that information to better communicate and sell sneakers. But we're looking at a different topic. And we found that there are 6 buckets of ways that people in the United States think about this. This is different also from other countries, pretty different. And so we got the alarmed right here. And these are the folks that are probably on this call right now. These are people who say it's definitely happening. It's definitely human caused. It's here and now. We got to do something about it. Concerned, they're the ones who say, it's happening and I'm worried, but it's really something for my kids that they're going to have to deal with, or my grandkids. It's not here and now. Or maybe it's people in poor parts of this country or in developing countries. They're going to have to deal with it. So that's where the concerned folks are on this. Cautious, they're saying, well, maybe it's happening, maybe it's not. I'm not quite sure. Let's be careful just in case. Disengaged, haven't really thought about it much, haven't heard about it. There's something else is occupying their minds. Doubtful, if it's happening, I don't think it's human caused. That's what these folks are thinking. And then we have the dismissive all the way over here on the right. And they're saying it's definitely not happening. It's definitely not human caused. And anything that is purported to be a solution, a climate change solution, I do not support that. Okay, so in the chat again, which of these do you think is the smallest? The smallest. Which one is the smallest of these in the US? Has the least people. Dismissive and alarmed are probably the smallest. So dismissive, the 2 extremes would be the smallest. The disengaged, got cautious, dismissive, doubtful, not sure, alarmed, smallest. Okay, which do you think is the largest? Largest. Concerned, disengaged, concerned, disengaged, concerned. Okay. Great. You ready? Give me a drum roll, someone. These are the actual numbers as of December. This past December, we're going to come out with new numbers soon. So it's interesting to see what's the difference between what you were thinking was the distribution here and what is the actual distribution. Why did we think the way we were thinking, and what are the implications of this? So a lot of people say dismissive. A lot of people suppose that dismissive are way bigger than they are. Why? Because they have a loud microphone, megaphone, because they are well funded, because they are well represented in Congress, and because you probably see them screaming on Facebook and other social media platforms a lot. But it's only 8% that are firmly convinced that climate change is not happening and not human caused in the United States. So what are the implications of that as well? A lot of folks come to us saying, I want to talk about climate change. How do you talk to people that are saying that climate change isn't happening? Do you really even need to put that much effort into that if there's only 8%? And then, whereas on the other side, we got alarmed, concerned. You got a majority of folks just between those 2 groups right there. Add cautious, and you have a large majority. And so one thing we think about is, what would it look like to activate the alarmed more than they already are? We'll look in a little bit at what percentage of those folks are involved in a climate change campaign, in climate change solutions. But we'll also think about, well, what are the different communication strategies? If you're talking with someone who's concerned, cautious, we'll dig a little bit more into each of those. Okay. And also it's interesting to know what's happening over time. So 2011, we had, you were right if you said that they were similar sizes, dismissive and alarmed back then. You would have been right, but things have changed a good bit. And now we have alarmed is the only group that's grown over all of these years by 15 percentage points in the past 5 years. And we've had dismissive shrinking. So now we have alarmed outnumbering dismissive by a good bit. And I suppose that things will continue in this direction. We'll see. Okay, so there's something called a spiral of silence. And the way this works is, we just saw it here actually, that a lot of folks underestimate how many people understand that it's happening. And we also underestimate how many people are alarmed. And so alarmed people are more numerous than you might expect. And the dismissive there's only 8% of them. But since we underestimate the level of worry in the United States, if you're thinking you want to talk about this because you're worried, you're alarmed, and you're sitting down at the Thanksgiving table at the water cooler when eventually we go back to work and there are things called water coolers again, and you're thinking, hey, I want to talk about this with my colleague, with my uncle, but most people aren't alarmed, most people aren't worried, so he doesn't want to talk about it with me. And he might be thinking the same thing about me. And so neither of us bring it up. And then that just reaffirms this idea that people aren't interested in talking about it. So then we continue going on, not talking about it. Okay. This is an interesting piece of research that was done by some of my colleagues at the program here. And they found that actually when you do start talking about it, it leads to greater acceptance of climate science, which then leads to people talking about it even more. So if you break the spiral of silence, then you can actually have a spiral going back in the other way, in a feedback loop that gets people to be more open, accepting the science, and even talking about it more, and then continuing the cycle. So good news. One of the main takeaways that I would like you to walk away from this with is talk about it. People are probably going to be on the same page a lot more than you might expect. And also share some of these stats here, and that will help convince other people to want to talk about it as well. Okay, we ask a question of people in our nationally representative survey twice per year. If you could ask an expert on global warming one question, which question would you ask? And we see some common themes that break down amongst the 6 Americas. And it's good to think about these as you're trying to understand an audience and think about how to communicate with that audience. What are their main questions? And so we see the alarmed and the concerned. What can the world and I do to reduce global warming? A lot of folks aren't sure. They say it's definitely happening. I'm worried, but I'm not sure what we should do. I'm not sure what I can do. I'm not sure what's effective. I'm not sure what we can do without breaking the bank. Okay, then we see amongst cautious and disengaged, what harm will it cause? Why should I care? These are the folks that don't really understand the impacts. They probably are really concerned about lots of issues that are connected to climate change, but they don't see the connection between their top 3 priorities for politicians or in life, or that they worry about, and climate change. And then we got folks, the doubtful and dismissive. How do you know that global warming is happening or human caused? And there are ways to answer these questions well. A lot here depends on the messenger too. And if you can get a messenger who's very similar to the doubtful or dismissive person, but gets the climate change thing more, then they're probably going to be one of your best messengers there. Okay, we've talked some about national statistics here. So we saw that 72% say that global warming is happening, but you're in New York. Is New York like the national average? Or if you're in Denver, or if you're in Tulsa, or wherever, a national number doesn't tell you all that much about your audience. So we've taken these numbers and we've downscaled them to all of these different scales: states, congressional districts, metro areas, and counties. And this can really be helpful. So we see here that 78%, up from 72 nationally, in New York State, say that global warming is happening. And we can drill down a little further and look at a congressional district, 15, for example, and see that 84% say that global warming is happening. So New York City, in a way, is pretty different from the national average, and that can inform your communication strategies. But then, besides understanding that it's happening, are people worried about it? And we see that 83% right here, in Congressional District 15, are worried about it. And also we see up here that 63% in the United States. So most people are worried about it, but they're not talking about it because they don't think the other people are worried about it. So interesting dynamics going on here. What can you do with this? So there's an amazing organization, the Alliance for Climate Education. One of our partners, we partner with small to large nonprofits, NGOs, but also with corporations that are interested in working on climate change, with elected officials, with state and local governments, museums, universities, anyone who wants to work on climate change and communicate effectively with it, we'd love to talk to you. So get in touch. But the Alliance for Climate Education, they were looking at our stats and they said, oh, wow, a strong majority of people want teachers, want schools to teach about climate change to their students. And so what their mission is actually is they train teachers to teach about climate change all across the United States. And they actually run Facebook ads to try and recruit these teachers. But if you're a teacher who, like everyone else, doesn't understand what people are thinking about climate change, then you're going to say, well, I'm worried about it, but I'm sure my students or their families, they're not worried about it and they don't want me to teach about it. So why would I sign up for this free climate lesson plans? But when the ACE decided to take some of these stats, and for the example, the Florida one, they were targeting on Facebook this video to try and recruit Florida teachers. And they let them know that 77% of Floridians wanted schools to teach about climate change. When a Florida teacher sees that, they're going to say, I want to do it. People want me to do it. I'm doing it. So all of a sudden, their acquisition costs dropped by 45% per new teacher that was going to be teaching about this. And so this is called social norming, social norms messaging. And a social norm is this idea of feeling pressure that it is the normal thing in society to want to do something about climate change, to be worried about climate change. If I think that other people want me to do something about climate change, and then I am way more likely to do something about climate change, whether or not at first I was wanting to do something about climate change. So it's great. This is how a big organization did it. But if you're at work or talking with a family or friend, a family member or a friend, if you help them understand how many people are worried that it's normal to be worried, that most people are worried, that most people want to do something, that most people support the solutions, then that can change the chip in their head, change the way they're thinking about it, and make them more willing to talk about it and act on it. Here's one other tool we have, the Yale Climate Opinion Fact Sheets, and it will break down all of the stats that we were looking at in the Yale Climate Opinion Maps for a congressional district or a county or a state. And you can actually customize them and turn on and off the different questions that will appear on here. And you can also hit a little button and get these in Spanish as well. And these are great for helping decision makers. Let's say you're working with a university and you want them to do something on climate change, but the university leadership thinks, oh, no one around here wants us to do anything on climate change. That's not what what the students, what the staff, what the citizens in the area are wanting. And you correct that misperception and say, actually, everyone's behind this. Like, we would be going along with public opinion by doing this. That'll change the university leadership. That'll change how the leadership of a nonprofit organization is thinking about whether or not they should tackle climate change by helping deliver these statistics in different ways and showing that there is a social norm. So yes, in the United States, the best predictor of what you think about climate change is your political leaning. That is not the case in other countries. In other countries, it's usually related to your level of education or a few other factors, whether or not you've heard about climate change, for example. And so we do see on this question, okay, hardly any Republicans are worried compared to the Democrats. And that might give you pause and think about, well, how do I tackle that? How do I think about a way forward here? A silver lining of our research is that despite not being on the same page when it comes to, is climate change happening? Is it human caused? Am I worried about it? We ask about a lot of the solutions and we find broad support. So here we're asking about funding research into renewable energy sources, and both Democrats and Republicans are way supportive of this all over the country. Something to think about though. So I talked at the beginning about me being on glaciers, and that was what did it for me, that made me want to work on climate change. And a common mistake of people wanting to communicate about an issue or climate change is thinking that, hey, if the reason that I was into this is probably going to inspire you as well, so I'm going to take you on a glacier and I'm going to talk about the glaciers, etc. And that's not going to work because you're coming from a very different angle. And the same here, that I can go and talk about renewable energy with different folks, but I have to understand that they support it for many different reasons. And while a lot of folks over here amongst Democrats are supportive of them because of climate change, a lot of folks over here, I mean, some folks on the Republican side are on the same page. There are a decent percentage of Republicans that understand and are worried about climate change, especially young Republicans. But a lot of folks over here are supportive of renewables for different reasons. So that's critical in thinking about how to talk about this with different folks. So here we asked folks across the political spectrum why they like the idea of renewable energy, and we saw big differences. We saw that top reasons for Republicans were reducing energy costs, getting energy from sources that never run out, reducing water pollution. Whereas the Democrats, a lot of them were about reducing air pollution, providing a better life for our children and grandchildren, reduce global warming was way up there. That's the largest gap between the two. So yes, we can get everyone on board and nudge folks towards renewable energy, but you have to do so in very different ways depending on where the folks are coming from. So that was a little bit talking about strategies with the dismissive and the doubtful there. Here, I'd like to talk about some strategies with the other four groups. So we have a radio program on 650 plus radio stations across the US 5 days a week called Yale Climate Connections. And it's just 90 seconds a day. And we have two main focuses or themes that run throughout these. One is that climate change is happening here and now. And here's a little story about how you can tell that it's happening here and now, but also that the solutions are happening here and now, right down the block, being implemented by people who aren't rocket scientists or brain surgeons and don't have $1 million budget and are doing that and actually getting co-benefits that are unrelated to climate change and improving their lives and saving them money in lots of different ways. You can go in also, we have a map if you want to look up the episodes that are based on stories both solutions and impacts around a given area. And you can zoom in and see all the New York stories and share them. A lot of the folks, like I was saying, the cautious and maybe the concerned, they don't get it that the effects are being felt here and now in New York City. But then a lot of the alarmed, they don't understand the solutions and how they're already being implemented down the street with current technologies. That you don't have to wait for some future new technology necessarily. So here we ask a question: how willing or unwilling would you be to join a campaign to convince elected officials to take action to reduce global warming? And we see that overall, here's all Americans on the very left, and we see that overall 1% say, I'm already doing this. But then we got 9% who say, I definitely would do this. And then another 20 saying, I probably would. These percentages are for US adults. So there's around 210 million adults. And so you can do the math on how many millions of people these turn out to be. But let's think about the potential of this. So there's something called an issue public in political science. And those are people that are really hardcore about an issue, working on it, thinking about it all the time. And we know of a handful of them that are very powerful. One that comes to mind is the gun rights lobby and movement. The NRA in particular is a key part of that. How big is the NRA? It's about 3 or 4 million. And think about what they've done, the power that they've been able to amass, and how much influence they have in Congress. And that's with 3 or 4 million people. And then think about these numbers here of what it would look like to even get half of this 9% of people who say they definitely would to join a climate campaign, how powerful that would be. It's interesting, we ask people, well, okay, if you're not doing something yet, why not? What are the barriers? The number one response, guess what it is in your mind right now? No one has asked me to. And so it's that simple. And we have to ask, especially alarmed folks, look over the alarmed here. We see that 4% of them are already participating, but 23% of them say they definitely would. They're waiting for someone to ask them. They're waiting for someone to break the spiral of silence. So that's one of the best things you could do when you're talking with alarmed folks. A lot of folks ask us, what can I do? And buckets that people think about when they're thinking of solutions and options are there's individual level actions and there's collective actions. I can do things like get a different car. I can do things like get rid of my car, use mass transit. I can change my light bulbs, insulate my attic, etc. And I was just listening to someone who crunched the numbers. Let's say you are the average person in the United States, and you get your carbon footprint to 0. What percentage of the global carbon footprint have you tackled by doing that? And 0.909% of the total carbon footprint. So nothing. Getting rid of one individual's carbon footprint does nothing. And so we need to, but at the same time, that's what needs to happen at a mass scale. So how can we take collective action? One, to bring as many people along with you as possible whenever you're taking an individual level action. What does that look like when you're putting solar on your house? Can you get as many of your neighbors as possible to put solar on their houses with you and get even a discount from the solar installer by doing so? But also how acting collectively can you change the system to make it easier for more people to take those individual level actions? How can you put the pressure on Congress or on your state or city government to change systems to make it more likely for all of the individuals to take the low carbon options and lifestyles and products that will help us all decrease at the scale we need our collective impacts and greenhouse gas emissions. And there's a great podcast, How to Change the World. I highly recommend it. And they have an interesting way of further digging in on what it might look like for you to take action. And they talk about this Venn diagram of looking for the overlap of what are you good at, what needs to be done, and what brings you joy, and finding that overlap might be the most sustainable way for you to keep it up and work on climate change. I just put a lot down, but there's a lot more research, questions you might have, and I would love to open it up for questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Well, thank you, Eric, for a fantastic presentation. Uh, I will kick it off with questions, and everyone please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A box, and we'll get through as many as we can in the next 20 minutes roughly. So the first question that I have is just related to the broader work that the program does. And it's of course widely circulated, cited, and respected in the climate communications field. What's next for the YPCCC?
What's not next? There's a lot we're working on. We've done a handful of international studies, and we did national studies in China and in India, and now recently in Brazil, and a lot of other countries have been reaching out to us to help design studies to better understand, because it's very different in other countries. And you can't use the Six Americas segmentation because the way people vary on how they're thinking about this is very different. For example, in India, most people haven't heard the term climate change. And in Hindi, the word climate change actually sounds something like it's a kind of not so technical sounding word. And it sounds kind of like things aren't so much like they used to be anymore. Uh, and then, so then we had to give them a definition of what climate change is and ask them, is that happening? They say, oh yeah, I see that, that's happening. So there's a much larger need for just basic awareness there as a first step, which is very different from here. So the international piece is one, but then another piece is better refining the communication strategies. What are the best ways to test messages to different segments of the US population to figure out how do we better get people over these barriers? How do we help them take action?
Thanks, Eric. We have a question in the chat from Hunter, and Hunter asks, how would you suggest we use climate change communication to get more Americans to value natural areas, especially in cities?
I mean, we look to some extent at the overlap to what extent do people understand the connection between climate change and natural areas. For example, I assume a lot of the folks on this call are familiar with the 30 by 30 initiative. By 2030, preserving 30% in the United States of all lands and waters. And so we look at that and try and understand what the support is, but also how do people make the connection between that and climate change? Do people see it as a way to adapt? Do people see it as a way to mitigate climate change? And better understanding that then helps you figure out your messaging strategy. And if you look in our latest climate change in the American mind, I'll drop the link in a second. If you look in our latest climate change in the American mind survey, then we actually asked a bunch of questions about that and about a lot of the other proposals that the Biden administration is putting out right now as well.
Thank you. We have another question from Julie, and Julie asks, is there research on different levels of success of your methods? For example, print versus social media, television, film, etc.
Yes. Some of our research and some of research from our partners that we help them with. And so just one example, one of the, we know that almost all climate scientists are on the same page saying that climate change is happening, it's human caused, it's bad, we got to do something about it, but there's hope. And but we ask people, what percentage of scientists are saying this? And people say, I don't know, about half of scientists. And and so people don't understand what the scientific consensus is. But then when you tell them what the scientific consensus is, then they then they all of a sudden go back and reassess and rethink to what extent they think the climate is changing, is human caused, and it's bad. So we've experimented with different ways of communicating this idea that scientists agree, and it's interesting of the different videos and infographics and ways of trying to communicate this. A pie chart of all those is the best.
The classic pie chart. Well, going along the same line related to media and methods, Daniel asks, how do we actually get the media to show the correct numbers of people who are interested in addressing issues of climate change so that we're closing the gap between what we're perceiving people think about climate change issues versus what your data and your research is showing?
One, you don't have to leave it strictly up to the journalists and the newspapers and the media in general. In that you can quote a lot of the public opinion research in your own op-eds, in your own letters to the editor, and we have a bunch of climate advocates around the country doing that, integrating uh, into their writing these stats. But two, we have research on how many people are actually interested in having media cover climate change. And it's a large percentage of folks. And so if you can show that research to any editors, to any journalists who are doubting it, then that can help as well. It's interesting because all across society, we're all bad at guesstimating what people are thinking on this issue, but it has different impacts depending on what positions you're in. So that editor at the New York Times is one person that to talk to about this, but also decision makers, politicians. We've had research in multiple sectors, weathercasters, all of them until they see the research, they're way off and they try and say what the US public thinks.
Excellent. So shifting gears a little bit towards the individual impact of how people are feeling climate change, Betsy asks, is your group studying communications with affected communities, those who have experienced flooding or storm impacts or even wildfires, about assisted or supported community relocation? How do you open up that conversation about relocation?
We haven't studied that too much yet. We but related is if we've done some research and we ask folks to estimate what level of worry there are amongst different demographic groups in society, and we tend to think that white people are the most worried, and that poor people and people of color are the least worried. But then when we ask people, all those populations themselves, how worried are you? White people actually say they are less worried than society thinks they are. And Latinos are at the other end of the spectrum, and they are the most worried of any group. And they are way more worried than what society thinks they are. And so it tends to be the frontline groups, the poorer communities, Black folks, Latinos, that are the most worried, but they don't understand the worry in their own communities because there's a spiral of silence there as well. And society doesn't understand how worried they are either. So there's a lot of potential in creating social norms to let all of those groups know, hey, actually, it's okay to talk about this. You're not going to be made fun of in your community because your community is the hardest hit, and we need to all work together to protect everyone here in the United States and in the world.
Yes, that changing perception of who is affected, who is not affected, and the way that we try to open up the conversation, that destigmatizing piece seems like it's so straightforward, but yet so elusive at the same time. How do you message around that? So we have another question from Jessica who asks, have you found anything related to helping people accept the fact that change to historic homes and buildings is necessary for future survival? From my understanding, it seems that the National Landmark Committees are okay with the change in order for climate change adaptation to occur.
We haven't done that exactly. Somewhat related. We, along the coast of Connecticut, we have studied how people evacuate during when there are flooding warnings, when hurricanes are coming, and what are the best methods for communicating to different folks. And so we do see that when messages are coming from from the government, from officials, that they're taken more seriously when the officer comes to their door and tells them exactly what's going on and that they need to leave their house on the shore and evacuate. That's the most effective method there.
That makes sense. And one question from Emily related to storytelling. It seems like if people are telling their stories about the real impacts that they're feeling, that maybe when, and unfortunately, if there is a moment where you do have to evacuate or you do have to relocate, that it's something that they take seriously because that time window, particularly if you're talking about flooding or other issues, can be so critical. So Emily asked if you think that storytelling in various media channels will be important in working on climate change, and is the YPCCC working with storytellers to become more effective in talking about climate change?
Definitely important. And we've done some research on this, actually on climate fiction, and found that it is effective in moving people in the right direction. But also there we need more storytellers and to raise them up, coming from every different perspective to connect with all different audiences. Right now, we're working with an organization called the Op-Ed Project, and uh, they they try to change who is writing history. They see that who writes op-eds? It's mostly white guys, and they would like to change that. So last year was the inaugural year, and we found 20 folks who were thought leaders in this space, and brought them together for a year-long experience where they were coached by two professional writers to polish their pieces and to get them in front of different audiences in newspapers across the United States, coming from angles that you don't necessarily always see, connecting climate change with issues that you don't often see connected with in the media. And so we're trying to help the storytellers tell their stories more effectively and raise up their voices.
Yeah, that question around who gets to tell the stories, and not just the personal experience, but scientists, researchers, really everyone, in creating a more diverse uh, set of messengers. That's so critical. We have a few more minutes left and a couple more questions. So May asks, have you had trouble with false information on climate change being spread, or have any ideas about how to combat the fake news?
Yes and yes. Uh, and so it's interesting just to think about one way, one platform, Facebook, and and we put all of these radio programs and a bunch of other materials in our research, both on the Yale Climate Connections Facebook page and on the YPCCC page. And the vast majority of people are very supportive and understanding of what the materials we're putting out there. But there are a small number of individuals who are very consistent at posting disinformation, misinformation, in these mediums as well. And so we've been working on an initiative with Facebook to help identify and combat misinformation on climate change. And then also, if you're interested in this, I highly recommend you check out a website called Skeptical Science, and it's put together by a colleague of ours down at George Mason University, John Cook, and they study what are all the speaking points of dismissive folks on climate change. And what does the science say about each of these main speaking points? What is the latest science? But they also have whole courses on disinformation and dismissiveness in general that you can take through them.
That's a new one. Thanks for sharing that resource. So two more questions. So one going along that line of how you combat the misinformation. Of course, we're in the process of reemerging from the pandemic, and there was some emerging research showing that the ideologies and communication patterns that were used by COVID deniers are actually kind of similar to what is used in terms of that language and narrative by climate deniers. So, are there lessons about mass public communication that we can learn from the pandemic that can help with climate communication?
We're trying. Uh, we actually, when the pandemic really started to hit hard, we said to ourselves, "Hey, like who is good at trying to understand how people think about risks in society, and what's the best way to use that information to effectively communicate about those risks?" Well, we kind of have some experience at it, so we retooled our survey making machines and started doing national surveys on COVID, and tried to do some over time to understand how the way people were thinking about COVID was evolving over time, and how also politics were influencing there. And I see the lessons going both ways, from climate change to COVID, and COVID back to climate change. Uh, when you think about the six Americas, um, we like to overlap them with all different kinds of groups in society. So if you think about urban versus suburban versus rural folks, within each of those three groups, there are going to be the six Americas. And so if your target audience is rural populations, if you can identify the alarmed in the rural populations, they are way more likely to be effective communicators on climate change to rural populations. And then you could think about all different kinds of groups in society, CNN watchers versus NPR listeners versus Fox News watchers. And we see that around 10% of Fox News watchers are alarmed about climate change. And so those folks can be the most effective messengers to a Fox News audience about climate change if you can find and activate those alarmed Fox News listeners. So a lot of the lessons hold true for COVID as well. How do you find, in a given target population that you're looking to work with, the folks that do already understand the science behind COVID and like the idea of being vaccinated, and how do you lift those folks up and support them as communicators to that audience?
That's encouraging. I'm looking forward to that new research coming through. So, our last question for the evening relates back to politics in New York City. So, I suspect that many of the people who are joining us this evening are in the New York City area, and they're getting ready to vote in the mayoral primary next month. And there are so many critical issues facing the country, and especially New York City, around post COVID economic recovery and police reform and affordable housing. And I'm curious what you would like to hear from a mayoral candidate about their plan for natural spaces and addressing climate issues in New York City.
Um, I mean, before even what I would like to know, I think it's important for all of those candidates to understand as much as possible the public opinion on climate change in New York City. Because if they haven't seen the research, they might be afraid to talk about climate change, or they might not know the best angle to take on talking about climate change. And we've had elected officials from across the United States come to us and say, my campaign director said, don't talk about climate change. I saw your public opinion data for my area, and I said, I'm going to talk about climate change, and I won. And so if you want to encourage them to talk about climate change, communicate to them what public opinion is, what in New York City, what public support is for different solutions, and get them to talk about climate change by helping them understand that.
Well, let's hope they take that approach and making climate a winning issue and really tapping into the general public that's interested in hearing and seeing that level of leadership is so critical. Well, thank you, Eric, for your amazing presentation and the answers to all the questions. I'm going to turn it back over to Tessa to close us out for the evening.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Eric. And again, and Lauren, you both did such a fabulous job tonight. The presentation, Eric, was so thorough and interesting. And thank you, Lauren, for navigating the Q&A and kind of getting our thoughts out there and answered by Eric.